Yeah, supplier marketing is a topic that I love. So I'm from the marketing side, so I might be a bit biased, but I do like those areas where you have that sort of intersection of two functions to see if there's any kind of cross-functional learnings that you have there, especially to answer the second part of the title that we have here. Can we use any of those learnings to look at how do we achieve mutual success with our suppliers? So just to set the scene a little bit, though, I wanted to start with the challenge that a lot of us feel today. And I have the privilege of speaking to practitioners all day long. So I've kind of aggregated a little bit the stories that I hear. So hopefully some of these points may resonate with you, maybe not all of them, but I think these are stories that we've all heard. So if we start off, and each of these problems actually has an impact on the organization as well. So I think one of the key ones that we all hear is supplier adoption and engagement is simply too low. And of course, the impact of that is that has a direct effect on the return on investment that we get on the technologies that we've invested in, the tools that we've put in place. We don't get that realization of value. But of course, the stakes are becoming ever higher because we need more information than ever before. Maybe for reporting, maybe for compliance. This list is growing. But as that list grows, of course, supplier experience suffers as well. And the burden is quite often shifted towards the suppliers, doing business with you perhaps more cumbersome than they would like. It adds costs for them, it adds costs for you as well. That also means that quite often we might have processes in place with limited or non-value add activities in terms of how the supplier views it, and that can lead to things like unsatisfactory processes, maybe longer lead times, cycle times than we'd really like. And it can create overly complicated processes as well, because quite often what we need to do to overcome these problems is introduce workarounds. Sometimes that's manual processes that are overlaid on top in order to get these tasks done. And with that comes another impact, which is process compliance. There's a much higher risk that vendors are not compliant with all of the requirements. That leads to lack of resource all round, and then we get to that data quality and miscommunication problem. And without the good quality data, the personalization becomes much more difficult. The one-size-fits-all strategy leads to confusion, to dissatisfaction, and then we get the result, which is the inconsistent supplier experience, resulting in the low engagement, the low adoption, kind of taking us in the vicious cycle back to the top. So a bit of creative license with that story there, but I'm sure a lot of those statements are things that a lot of you have felt across the business. But it's not just anecdotal. So I wanted to share with you a couple of statistics, actually, from our Voice of Supplier survey. So we surveyed 1,000 suppliers to get their view on this and to ask them what it's like to work with large enterprises. So in this survey, the largest the suppliers of some of the largest enterprises in the world were asked what it's like for them and what experience they have. Now, 98% of suppliers think that improvements in communications are necessary, but also 48% of suppliers say significant improvements are needed. So there's some overwhelming evidence that there are things that we need to be thinking about and doing. And then on the data demands, 61% of suppliers agree that their most important customer sends them too many information requests, and 60%, very similar number, say that their most important customer expects them to do too much administration. So suppliers really struggling to keep up with those data demands. And removing friction would be better all round, because when thinking about requests for information, such as surveys or questionnaires, 54% of suppliers said they would be able to reply to requests more accurately if it was easier to work with their largest customer, and 54% of suppliers agreed they would be able to provide more detailed feedback. So that's some of the view there from the suppliers. I think in your packs there is a brochure, and the full report is in there. So if you want to go into that into more detail, that's available to you. But enough of the challenge. What we really want to focus on is what is the solution to this. And this is where we think the whole concept of supplier marketing comes to the fore. So I'm going to start with a statement. This is perhaps rather utopian, but it is a nice one. I'm sure we'd all like to get here, which is imagine a world in which many different people from various functions across the enterprise are able to quickly and efficiently get their jobs done because they are able to engage with suppliers, and only the relevant suppliers, quickly and easily. But of course, there's a barrier to this, which is your suppliers are the ones who choose how much to engage. So, and I'm sure we've all felt aspects of this as well. They may be slow to respond. They may need lots of reminding. They may only give partial responses. They may just log in once to a tool and never return. They might do the bare minimum. They may not have seen or received the email, and they may hope that the request for the information may go away if they ignore it and you stop asking. But the interesting thing here is marketing has exactly the same challenge. So this is where we start to see some of the parallels that we wanted to dig into in this session. But from a marketing perspective, if we look at it through the marketing lens on the world, we also can't force anybody to come to a webinar. Can't force somebody to read a white paper to the end. We can't click the request demo button on behalf of somebody else, and we can't force anybody to join us for half a day here in Amsterdam. We'd love to, but we can't do that. What we can do, however, is we can advertise across as many relevant channels as possible. We can make a white paper useful and relevant to our target audience throughout the white paper. We can ensure our request demo button is easy to find, the form is as frictionless as possible, and the next steps are very clear. And we can send reminders to people, in the case of events, about what they might be missing out on. But in other words, what we're doing is we're influencing people's actions or behavior by either persuading them or incentivizing them to do those things that we'd really like them to do. And of course, marketing is quite a well-established function, so we can look to some of the core principles that have emerged out of digital marketing when we think about marketing to a customer. And the number one thing is, of course, the idea of segmentation. So we segment the audience and we target based on the relevant characteristics of that audience. So that gives us a much better idea about who it is that we're actually speaking to. And of course, as soon as we get to the answer of who we're speaking to, the next step becomes much easier, which is we can say, is there an action or is there an offer that is very compelling or most relevant to that specific audience? And then the next thing we do is the where are our audience, and we will use multiple channels and we will coordinate those as much as we can for the maximum impact. So the question then is, if those principles apply to marketing to a customer, we take this notion and run with it in terms of supplier marketing, can we rephrase this from a supplier marketing perspective? And I think a lot of the parallels are actually there between those two concepts. So marketing to a supplier, for example, that who question, we may prioritize based on a supplier type, category, location, the size of the supplier. All of these different suppliers will actually behave and react in different ways to the information requests that we send out. We might also consider job roles within the supplier side. So here, again, when we answer that who question, we get onto the messaging, this starts to become easier because what we may want to do when we reach out to suppliers is also articulate some kind of value message in the supplier's terms. Why is it a benefit for them also to cooperate and help us with the information requests that we have? So again, this is what we call in marketing personas, but it's those personas where we think about, are we articulating a value message that means the supplier in their role can also get their jobs done? And then where are they? So there's lots of options that we have here, maybe notifications we can put through existing tools. Of course, that interrupts work, so we do want to do that carefully. But there's other mechanisms we can use as well. For example, it's been talked about quite a bit today, something like a portal, for instance, where that is segmented with the right content for suppliers once they log in. Emails is another option. The point being, again, these different channels will be more or less effective depending on the group of supplier that we're trying to reach. And of course, segmentation, though, when we think about procurement, isn't something entirely new. We do it. We're used to this. And if we think about the traditional segmentation, different models here that we can apply. But these traditional segmentation models tend to be quite internally focused. So really, this is our view on the supplier as opposed to how the supplier see themselves. And this is very handy for resource allocation and those types of activity. But what we're trying to think about here is, can we overlay on top some of these other more supplier-specific focused characteristics that might help us understand a little bit more how they react in different scenarios. And these types of characteristics may be, for example, something like a geographic characteristic. So different legislation impacts different geographies around the world, has different relevance. It may be transactional, so we may want to do something different with our high volume or high spend suppliers versus the others. It may be a category-based type of segmentation that we do because, of course, legislation around something like plastic, for instance, it may be much more vital that we get in contact with our packaging suppliers first. It's much more relevant to them. There's profile-based, so we may look at things like indirect versus direct suppliers. Firmographic is an example that we'll use later on. So when I come to the use cases to sort of bring this alive, we'll have a look at how we can use firmographic data. We may use performance or behavior-based data, such as, for example, suppliers who engage with us versus those who do not, or supplier preference-based. This may be where suppliers have themselves defined some of the ways in which they want to be contacted and how they will best respond. Of course, the elephant in the room here is when we go from that traditional segmentation and we think about segmentation in this sense, it's a valid question, isn't this far too many segments to manage? But I think in terms of countering that, what I would say is these segments aren't being managed in that traditional sense. It's simply, the best way to think of it is as a filter applied to suppliers who match conditions of that filter at a certain time and for whom certain communications may be relevant. So segmentation then is a method of generating a specific list of suppliers based on certain selected attributes for whom different communications, tools, or workflows will apply based on the use case or the task that we're trying to achieve. And it always comes back to this, but of course, good quality data and automation then is the part that really helps us to manage which suppliers are in which segments and at what times. The point being, we're not building these segments from day one to be managed as individual segments. All right, but to bring this to life, let's have a look at 3 use cases. So the first one, it's been mentioned throughout today, so it's top of mind, but greenhouse gas emissions reporting. So we could just formulate a statement around this. I think this is a fair statement to say we would want to articulate something like, we need to improve the accuracy and increase the scope of our greenhouse gas emissions reporting to also start including more input from more suppliers in the long tail. So we can kind of put that into a framework, so to speak, and think of it how marketers would also start to construct what they would call a campaign around this particular use case that they want to overcome. And of course, as soon as we've identified the use case, starts to reveal to us, what are the challenges then? Why isn't this happening? And we can then articulate that as well. So the ability to answer certain questions varies according to the size of the supplier being us, and that may be a fair assumption. So if we take that as our assumption, the next step is we can start to say, well, what in that within that assumption would be the role here then of segmentation? So it starts to give us our use case as well for the segmentation aspect. So having one tailored questionnaire for small size suppliers and one for large size suppliers will help us potentially overcome some of those answers that we're not getting from the different supplier base, the supplier bases. Then what we want to do is align each questionnaire very closely to the abilities of the supplier to respond. And at this point, we can start thinking about, is there actually customized follow-up that we can do for each of the relevant groups, maybe offering a different level of support? May we propose different timelines for the collection of responses? And that could be based on the level of resource that we think the supplier has on their side. But the key point here is when we get to this last part of the framework, which is we're doing this very deliberately because we do a lot of this on an ad hoc basis. But what we're thinking about here is how do we make this a very deliberate, objective-based activity that we carry out? So here, it's important to say a statement like, what we actually want to do is increase the response rate maybe from 25% to 35%. Or another objective may be, we want to decrease the time taken to collect responses from 40 days to 30 days, whatever the objective might look like. Of course, that's just one survey or one area that we're thinking about. So the next thing is, especially as this list gets longer, we're needing to scale up on this process as well. And this is another area where segmentation comes in really handy. So when we think about scaling, and that list that I mentioned here, it could be the sustainability questionnaire, but we've added others to this. It could be water wastage, there's minerals compliance, there's forest protection, and the list goes on and on. And here, just to talk us through what we've got on this diagram, you see across the top, we've got the months of the year, and we've got our different segments. So we might say we need different levels of, or different cadence of response from different types of supplier. So our large size direct suppliers may be very different, we need it very frequently, versus medium-sized direct suppliers, and then something very different, a different cadence for small-sized direct suppliers, and so on. In other words, we're kind of looking at that calendar and holistically at that list of requests that we are expecting to come in from perhaps different functions across the organization to say, is there a way that we can make this calendar easier for our suppliers? And that may be with the segmentation, we say, this segment gets monthly, this segment gets quarterly, this segment we can cope with only having that data annually. And we can also, when we look at the calendar holistically, start saying, and is there also a more convenient month for the different suppliers with different levels of resource for those types of survey to go out? The point being, overall, what we're doing is actually now beginning to create those personalized journeys for those different supplier segments. And if you think about doing all of those requests all at once for all suppliers versus when we start to segment it out, it also should reduce the burden in terms of follow-up on the business side for the enterprise as well. So that's the scaling example. And then the final use case, the supplier adoption of an online tool or service. And this is just a brainstorm of some of the ideas. We often get this a question around, how do we get suppliers to adopt more of our digital services, more of our tools? And of course, if you look at the armory that we use in marketing, these similar tactics may well work. Repeat invitation emails as opposed to just the one that may get sent out the one time only. There may be a provoked engagement tactic that we can use, which is a bit similar to the banks, which says, here's a piece of information, can you check if it's correct, and please log into the tool to correct your information. So maybe tie it to another piece of information. There's a direct campaign approach that we could take. So we may actually just want to ring up a certain group of suppliers and take them through the registration process, because that's an easier way of getting them into our systems. We can also think about, and this goes back to that value message that I was talking to earlier, we can think about, do we market high value or nice to have offers to the supplier? So this may be something like in the email saying, and if you complete this task, you'll have access to your payment status information. So something there for the supplier. And then if we take this even further, these kind of get more potentially more complex as we go down the list, but we can even think about a supplier reward scheme, which may say that if the suppliers start undertaking those tasks and activities that we want them to do, there are points that can be allocated to them, which they could then trade in maybe for a face-to-face meeting with a buyer or whatever we want the incentive there to be. The point being, though, that again, without the segmentation, these different approaches will work in different ways for different suppliers, and we wouldn't be able to resource that in the same way across the entire supplier base. So those segments will help us decide what's effective, what works in a particular supplier group, and then when we've found those effective activities, we can actually say, let's focus on those much more than perhaps some of the others, and start changing the way in which we engage with our suppliers, which is exactly what we do in the marketing side, which is that experimentation, iteration. We learn more about each of these groups of suppliers, and then we can use that to make sure that we put the resource adequately in the right places. But in summary, for each of those use cases, and again, going back to that kind of marketing theme, those three principles, when we're thinking about the information exchange, apply, which is we're thinking about audience. So we're segmenting, we're trying to get to that segment of one where each supplier is only getting the relevant requests, those that apply to them. We're looking at what's the value for the supplier. We're deciding based on those groups what level of support we may be able to provide. and we're identifying those mutual goals. And where possible, we might put in place those incentives. And then the channels, we went through those: emails, telemarketing, etc. But the point I wanted to end on is it's all about that kind of experimentation and iteration of those activities that you're undertaking. And in terms of the metrics that we may consider, I think the obvious one perhaps is our response or fill rate for an initiative. And again, each time you apply the segmentation, you look to improve that particular metric over time. We may look at our adoption rate, perhaps, of a particular scheme, service, or system. We may be looking at other metrics, such as the average time taken for an activity to be undertaken from initiation right the way through to completion. We may be looking at reducing the number of inquiries that are associated with a specific initiative. We may even want to start thinking about supplier satisfaction, maybe a follow-up to say how easy was it for you to undertake the task. And overall, those improvements in data quality, accuracy, and completeness. So in summary, I guess what I would say is in order to embark on this journey, I'd say number one is don't boil the ocean. You saw in all the examples, they were super simple, and generally you would want to start there, and then the sophistication sort of comes later over time. But start with the simple use case where you do have the metrics, you know that you can track it, and you can see what the improvements look like, and definitely, just as marketers, experiment, iterate over time, and allow that sophistication to develop. And as we saw from the calendar slide, we're really not just orchestrating necessarily processes for our suppliers, but here we're really thinking about how are we orchestrating those experiences. So that's all I have, but hopefully a few ideas there for you to take away.